This is Croatia, a country home to over 3.5 million people and boasting one of the fastest growing economies in Europe. What makes all of this surprising is that just 3 decades ago, Croatia was in dire poverty. It took only 2 decades for Croatia to overcome the poverty and become a role model for other countries. The country successfully navigated through countless financial challenges, such as 2008 economic crisis,
Barclays that began the steep decline, and in the following 40 minutes of trading, shares in the country's biggest banks were sold down,
and emerged as one of the fastest growing economies in Europe, even surpassing countries like Slovakia, Hungary, Greece and Turkey. To really understand how big of an economic success Croatia is, we have to remember that Croatia had the fastest growing economy in the European Union between 2019 and 2024. However, behind the fastest growing European Union economy, there are some cracks that could potentially lead to its downfall. So the main question is, how did Croatia's economy grow so fast, and what are the challenges that could potentially lead to its downfall? To really understand the full topic, we have to divide the video in several chapters. Croatia's economic history under Austro Hungarian and Yugoslavia. Independent Croatia, the good, the bad and the ugly. Croatia now, modern challenges and opportunities. Croatia has a rich history, and we could talk about it for hours, but to keep things brief, let's focus on the last 2 centuries. In the 19th century, Croatia was part of Austro Hungarian Empire. At the time, its economy was mostly based on agriculture, with smaller contributions from shipbuilding and lumber mills. While there were some pockets of industrialization, it remained quite limited compared to other parts of the empire. The first Croatian railway opened in 1862, stretching about 120 kilometers. Although the railway network expanded quite quickly, industrial growth was much slower. The Austro-Hungarian Empire tended to focus development around its core regions, leaving Croatia with less political influence and fewer resources for industrial expansion. After the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Croatia joined with Serbia and Slovenia to form a new kingdom, which was officially renamed the Kingdom of Yugoslavia in 1929. At that time, Yugoslavia was one of the least developed countries in mainland Europe, so it was making gradual progress in improving its economy. During World War II, Croatia briefly became a puppet state aligned with the Axis powers. However, after the war, it was reintegrated into Yugoslavia and had to adopt a socialist economic model. Yugoslavia was made up of 6 federal republics and followed a command economy, where the government held much greater control than in capitalistic systems. However, Yugoslavia's approach was unique. Unlike the Soviet Union, where economic decisions were made strictly from the top, Yugoslavia introduced a system called worker self-management. In this model, factories and enterprises were largely managed by the workers themselves. Despite being a socialist state, Yugoslavia sought to distance itself from the Soviet control. In 1948, the Tito-Stalin split marked Yugoslavia's break from the Soviet sphere. Yugoslavia's leader, Josip Broz Tito, later helped establish the non-aligned movement in 1961. This movement promoted the idea that developing countries should not side with either the Western or Eastern blocs during the Cold War. Instead, they advocated for finding an alternative path. During its existence, Yugoslavia underwent rapid industrialization. Many of its republics became more urbanized, and new industries began to replace agriculture as the main economic driver. Among Yugoslavia's republics, Croatia and Slovenia were the wealthiest by GDP per capita. Croatia benefited from important port taxes and a more developed industrial base compared to others. However, starting in the 1970s, Yugoslavia's economy began to slow down, and this decline accelerated in the 1980s. After Tito's death in 1980, political tensions started going up, creating a power vacuum. And with the economy worsening, more republics began pushing for independence. In 1991, Croatia declared independence, but this was met with resistance from the rest of the Yugoslavia. Croatia fought a war of independence, which ended in victory. However, the country's economy was heavily damaged in the process, so the key question is, how did Croatia transform from a war-torn country into one of Europe's fastest growing economies? That question brings us to chapter 2. A lot of things went wrong once Croatia gained independence. For one, they had to essentially navigate while adopting a different economic model and at the same time dealing with war issues. In 1995, Croatia agreed to inherit part of Yugoslavia's debt, and that led to more than half of the country's debt coming from that agreement. The country also suffered from high inflation and unemployment. However, both of those problems were quickly dealt with. What made Croatia so attractive to investors was its closeness to the European Union market. The country is situated super close to big European economies such as Austria, Germany, Italy and others, and its strategic location not only boosted tourism but also made it easier to serve as a transportation hub. Croatia established few financial institutions that basically turned the country to investors' greenhouse. For example, Croatian Bank for Reconstruction and Development is a state-owned bank which is mostly used for funding big important national projects and investments, such as building highways, modernizing ports, and helping the tourism sector. Croatia also has several investment institutions that helps foreign investors to invest in local economy. With everything being said, it's worth mentioning that Croatia has few problems that will be very important to deal with. Croatia's economy is not exactly as diversified as we would like it to be. For one, it's extremely dependent on European Union and tourism. The country's economy was hugely damaged by the 2008 financial crisis, during which the unemployment skyrocketed. At the same time, the GDP declined and it took almost a decade for it to recover. Croatia joined the European Union in 2013 and that opened the door to new possibilities. The European Union was actively investing in this country. However, Croatia still suffers from many issues including low fertility, brain drain and extreme dependence on tourism, which brings us to chapter 3. Even if Croatia has one of the fastest growing economies in the European Union, it still has a lot of cracks in the system that could lead to its downfall. For one, we have to realize that Croatia is extremely dependent on tourism. In 2022, revenue from foreign visitors equaled to 18.9% of Croatia's GDP. This puts Croatia as one of the most tourism-dependent countries in the world. While tourism has some positive effects, such as multiplier effect, which means that tourism revenue ends up circulating in the country and helps other sectors, country being over-dependent on this sector could be extremely risky. For one, during financial downturns, people tend to travel less. For example, after 2008 financial crisis, Croatia's tourism sector was hit hard. Foreigners were cutting the trips shorter and they were spending much less on the trips. This, combined with higher interest rates, caused a recession in Croatia, which dramatically increased unemployment and economic instability. On the other hand, most of Croatia's main export partners are in the European Union. In 2024, Germany, Italy, Slovenia, Hungary and Austria made up almost half of Croatia's exports. This creates a risk. If another crisis hits the European Union, Croatia's economy could take a serious hit because it relies heavily on trade within the European Union. Recently, several of these countries, including Germany and Italy, have faced slow economic growth and political instability. Such developments could put pressure on Croatia's economy. Another issue that Croatia might suffer from is small population. Now, small population is not necessarily a big problem for countries, however, it makes countries less attractive to investments. Croatia is suffering from very low fertility rates. What makes the situation worse is that the country is also suffering from brain drain. Being in the European Union, it is much easier for educated professionals to leave the country and work in wealthier nations. This has already negatively impacted the country's population. In the early 1990s, Croatia had more than 4.5 million people. However, that number now has reduced to less than 4 million people. Moreover, Croatia's median age is at almost 45 years old, which puts it as one of the highest aging population in the world. Last but not least is the issues with bureaucracy and taxes. Croatia's bureaucracy is famous for being extremely slow. The slow process, especially with giving building permits, can possibly deter a lot of investors from investing and executing their business plans. Even the biggest city in Croatia, Zagreb, has less than 1 million population, which makes it quite less attractive for investments compared to other cities in different countries. By all means, Croatia is a decent place to invest. However, the aging population coupled with slow bureaucracy and not so low taxes compared to Ireland or Cyprus makes it a little less attractive for investors. On the other hand, Croatia is heavily funded by the European Union. However, according to some economists, the jobs added by the European Union funds are not necessarily as productive as we would like it to be. Croatia will have to be extra efficient with the European Union funds. Croatia was a big part of RRF funds, however that funding will stop in 2026. The Union will introduce new funding initiatives in 2027. However, it is expected that Croatia will receive a lot less compared to what they are getting for now. It is expected that Croatia will receive 16.8 billion euros from 2028 to 2034, which is 33% less compared to what they were getting between 2021 and 2027. International Monetary Fund has issued a small warning to Croatia, noting that a huge portion of growth and investment came from European Union's financing, and that the country will have to be very careful to not over-rely on it. However, I still believe that Croatia has its chances to not only strengthen its economy, but also explore other industries. Geography is Croatia's strong point. It has easier access to huge European markets, while at the same time having enough shore to import and export goods to other continents. The issue with Croatia's economy is not whether or not they have enough resources, but more about how and when those resources could be used. For one, Croatia will have to try and diversify their economy, meaning that they might have to provide a bigger incentives for local and foreign businessmen to invest in other sectors besides tourism, while at the same time making sure that the investors will have painless process in terms of filing out all the necessary paperwork. Hey, thank you for watching my video. If you have liked the video, please subscribe so you will not miss out on our future uploads.